Committee on Transportation Infrastructure will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the chair and ranking member of the full committee be recognized for 10 minutes each during the first round of questions. Without objection, so ordered. Before I begin, I want to explain an administrative matter regarding some of the documents we may use in today's hearing and that will be entered into the record. I'll be making 2 unanimous consent requests in reference to 2 documents, List A and List B. First, the documents contained on List B are marked export controlled. We have been advised by the House General Counsel that the Constitution provides ample authority for us to release these documents. The documents from Boeing, Boeing's attorneys agreed to the release of these documents. I see nothing that is export sensitive in these documents. The FAA stamped every document they sent us as export controlled. However, to prevent confusion with regards to documents with export controlled markings on them, I will be making a unanimous consent request regarding the release of these documents pursuant to the Export Control Act. Second, I'll be making a unanimous consent request to enter the documents on List A into the hearing record. This list includes the export control documents on List B, as well as additional documents. The ranking member's staff is aware of all these and has reviewed all these documents that are on both lists. With that, I ask a unanimous consent that the documents on List B be disclosed pursuant to 50 U.S. Code section.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I want to reserve my right to object at this point.
Gentleman is recognized.
The reason for doing that is we've had at least two that I can remember, hearings noting China's infiltration of American industries, getting our, and that includes rail, maritime, transit, you name it, and they would love to have the opportunity to get their hands on technology from the aviation industry as well. And it concerns me in a big deal. We have talked about this and gone over this. In making these documents have all been made available to everybody on the committee. Making these documents available to the public or putting them out there in the public domain, I think is I think it's a real problem. I do, and I think we're cutting ourselves off, at the legs when it comes to that technology. It concerns me. It concerns me in a big way. And I really want us to think about that moving forward. Having said that, I will withdraw. My right to object and allow this to move forward because I do want to get answers. I think we can get the answers without these, but I do want to get the answers, so I'll remove that request.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I didn't take a back seat to anybody in the issues regarding China. I voted against most favored nation status. I opposed them going into the WTO. I've raised concerns for decades about their theft of U.S. technology and their unfair trade practices. So I certainly share the gentleman's concerns. I have reviewed these documents. I don't think there's anything in there that will be of any utility to the Chinese. But in any case, I recognize your concerns. So I just have to finish reading this. List B will be disclosed pursuant to 50 United States Code Section 4820H2B2 because withholding such information is contrary to the national interest. Without objection, so ordered. In addition, I ask unanimous consent to enter all the documents on List A into the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. Let's proceed now to the hearing. I first want to recognize the families who are here today. I've met twice with families. I don't know if I've met with all of you who are here today. And I want to convey my utmost condolences. It's 1 year and 1 day after the Lion Air crash. Very somber day. We shouldn't have had to be here, but we are, and we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to see it never happens again. With that, I would thank the witnesses for being here, Mr. Muilenburg, Mr. Hamilton. This fourth hearing the committee has held, first full committee hearing. Given the extraordinary interest of members of the committee, I felt it best to do it in full committee. I know that Boeing told us that they wanted to wait until the airplane was ungrounded, but I felt it was very important for them to testify before that happened. We're here today because 346 people, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, died on 2 MAX aircraft within a 5-month period. Something went drastically wrong. As you know, our committee has been conducting a very robust investigation. Been on this committee a long time. We have never undertaken an investigation of this magnitude, to the best of my knowledge, in the history of this committee, which is the second oldest committee in the United States Congress. And we have received hundreds of thousands of pages of documents from Boeing. They have been cooperative in providing those documents and agreeing that we could use those documents in the public hearing. We have received tens of thousands of pages from the FAA. We have conducted some hearings with FAA employees. We have others we wish to interview. We have requested to interview Boeing employees, but we're told that we have to be in line behind the Justice Department. So those are still forthcoming. There are a lot of unanswered questions that we need to get to the bottom of. We know that a novel system, new and novel system, called MCAS, took these 2 planes into an uncontrollable attitude after it repeatedly triggered, having to do with a faulty or missing sensor. These were wired to one, in this system was wired to one sensor. And in May, then Acting Administrator Elwell sat there, and I asked him, was MCAS a safety critical system? He said, yes. Then how could it have been approved to trigger with a single point of failure? He had no answer to that. How could the FAA approve it? How could the manufacturer do that? He had no good answer. That will be, we are going to continue to pursue the roots of this problem. We do know that at one point Boeing had planned to inform pilots about MCAS. In fact, it was in the first version of the flight manual when it was a relatively benign system. But when it became a radical system, which could trigger a catastrophic failure, it came out. Some of that was discussed in the Senate yesterday. It'll be discussed here again today, particularly quoting from Boeing's chief test pilot and his instant messages. Seems inexplicable. Secondly, we do know that Boeing engineers actually proposed placing a MCAS enunciator in the cockpit. But again, that came out in later versions or in the actual production version. And then it wasn't until after Lion Air that Boeing informed anyone. Boeing engineers actually proposed placing a MCAS enunciator in the cockpit. But again, that came out in later versions or in the actual production version. And then it wasn't until after Lion Air that Boeing informed anyone, and still at that point I think soft-pedaling MCAS, that it was in the plane. I've talked to a lot of pissed off pilots. They said, we were the backup system? How can we be backup if we don't know something's going to take over our plane? There's quite a bit of discontent out in the aviation community about that. We now know that Boeing and the FAA assumed pilots would appropriately react in 4 seconds. 4 seconds. But Boeing had information, which we'll get to a little later in this hearing, that some pilots might react in 10 seconds or longer, and if that happened, the results would be catastrophic and result in the loss of the aircraft, as happened twice. We now know from the very beginning, the plane's development, Boeing was, they had a phone call. The phone call was, hey, major customer, we're going to buy Airbus. They have better fuel economy, and the pilots don't need retraining, which is very expensive and disruptive of our schedules. So Boeing, from day one, had to meet that. Instead of a clean sheet airplane, they got the 12th or 13th iteration of the 737 amended type certificate. That meant big engines mounted forward, flies differently, and they had to develop a system to make it fly the same as the others so it wouldn't have to go through pilot training or recertification. And that drove the whole process. We do know that Boeing offered Southwest Airlines $1 million per plane rebate if the pilots had to be retrained. Imagine what the pressures were from the top on down to mid-level, low-level engineers. You're saying, what? No. Can't have that. It's cost us $1 million a plane, $300 million for that one contract. Maybe other contracts had the same provision. Cost us our marketing advantage. Slow things down. And then, there's been a lack of candor all through this. Boeing learned that the AOA, angle of attack, disagree light, which was a standard feature on all Boeing 737s, did not work on this plane unless someone bought the upgraded package. We were told that was an inadvertent software error in developing the upgraded package. But that may be so. But Boeing decided to delay the fix for 3 years until 2020. They didn't tell the FAA, they didn't tell the customers, and they didn't tell the pilots about this until after the Lion Air crash. That's inexplicable. They say, well, it's not necessary for safe operation of the MAX, but keeping everybody in the dark and having that, there it is, it's there, it's right in front of the pilot, it's not lighting up. Well, it can't light up, even if there is disagreement. And it was included in the flight manual, unlike MCAS. Wow. So you include something in the manual that doesn't work, but something that is going to work and potentially cause catastrophic issues is not in the manual. What was that all about? We know there was tremendous pressure on production. We have Boeing whistleblowers have contacted us that, regarding features engineers wanted to put on the MAX, but were denied because of the rush to get this plane out the door and compete. We have from an internal whistleblower a survey conducted November 16 that 39% of Boeing employees surveyed they experienced undue pressure. 29% said they were concerned about consequences. You might lose your job, I guess, if they reported these incidents. We now know at least one case where Boeing manager implored then Vice President, General Manager of the 737 program to shut down the 737 MAX production line because of safety concerns several months before the first tragic Lion Air crash. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know what would happen if a different path had been followed here exactly. We don't know if these pilots had had simulator training that replicated this system, what would have happened. We don't know why Boeing designed a plane with a safety-critical system side to a single point of failure. Inexplicable, inexcusable, and as far as I know, unprecedented in the history of passenger aviation production. We do know, and we have seen, that pressures from Wall Street, market forces, have a way of influencing the decisions of the best companies in the worst way, endangering the public, jeopardizing the good work of countless hardworking employees on the factory lines. And I hope that's not the story that is ultimately going to be written about this long-admired company. So we need today, Mr. Muilenburg, Mr. Hamilton, we need answers, but we also know that we need reforms on how commercial aircraft are certified and how manufacturers, not just Boeing, all, are watched and overseen by the regulators. This hearing today and investigation is not just about getting answers to our questions, but how to make the system safer and prevent future tragedies. With that, I yield time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I do want to extend my condolences to the families and friends of the accident victims. I can't imagine how hard it is to, to sit and go through this this process. I'm going to divert from my statement for just a minute and associate myself with a couple of comments that the chairman made. And I too, as a pilot, having a piece of equipment in an airplane that I don't know about is something that concerns me in a big way. And that comment about pilots saying, you know what, we're the backup system, it does concern me. But I do want to point out, though, as well, when it comes to Airbus, because it was mentioned too that Airbus, there were customers that wanted to look at Airbus as opposed to the Boeing product. But in an Airbus aircraft, the pilot is the backup system. You can't shut it off. The similar system, I should say, very similar system in an Airbus that's in a Boeing MAX, MCAS, you can't shut it off. It overrides the pilot. Overrides the pilot. Whereas MCAS can be shut off, and that's one of the things about, when it comes to being a pilot, you want to be able to shut a system off that has failed and be able to fly the airplane, and that's what I've harped on over and over and over again. And it's my hope that Mr. Muilenburg's testimony today is going to help us understand the decisions that Boeing made between 2009, 2017, regarding the design and certification of the 737 MAX. Some of those decisions were reviewed and approved by the Boeing organization, the designation authority, or the ODA. We keep using that term, obviously. It's on behalf of the FAA. And while the Boeing ODA was authorized to act for the FAA, as the regulator of the FAA, they retain the ultimate responsibility for overseeing the compliance with all safety regulations. It still lies within the FAA. And I know the chairman said we've still got a lot of other people to hear from, and hopefully I do want to hear from. We're hearing from the Boeing leadership today, at the time of these decisions, but to get a complete picture, I would like to hear from the FAA officials that were there at the time, between 2012, 2017, when these decisions were being made. And I hope that I can get a commitment, and I'm sure you don't have any problem with that,
I commit
to do
that we will be hearing from FAA.
And because we got to hear from everybody, that's the bottom line. And I've said before, though, and many times, the various investigations, they reveal problems. If these investigations reveal problems with certification, then I think Congress should act to fix those specific and identifiable problems. And that's going to be the issue, is identifying what those problems are. But in the aftermath of these accidents, we can't address safety of the aviation system by focusing on one single factor, and there's never one single factor that contributes to an accident. I've heard safety experts refer to, the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. In this model, if you use this model, you have layers, many layers of accident protection that are visual. If you visualize them as slices of cheese with holes that represent the weaknesses, some of those weaknesses are due to, conditions. Others are due to active failures. But when an accident occurs, when all of those holes and weaknesses, when they line up, that's when you have a catastrophic failure. And in the context of the 737 MAX, we have to consider all of those layers, all of them, when it comes to the protection and safety. And, when we try to determine, what weaknesses are out there and try to figure out what those weaknesses are. So as an investigator, the Indonesian government said about the Lion Air accident, and I quote, if one of those 9 contributing factors did not happen, the crash would not have happened. One particular layer, the design and certification of the 737 MAX, that's the focus of a number of investigations. And earlier this year, Boeing took responsibility for the MCAS design weaknesses, and they've been working on a software fix, which we're waiting to hear about that. But other weaknesses, Boeing, with the FAA's oversight, that we're going to address, they include pilot displays, operation manuals, crew training. Today, we're going to hear about the status of all of those efforts. But I want to hear about how these efforts line up with the recommendations of the Joint Authorities Technical Review, or the JTAR, the first completed review of the MAX certification by individuals with vast aviation and technical expertise is obviously due soon. But while the JTAR didn't call for an end to the FAA's delegation programs, it did highlight some bureaucratic efficiencies in the relationship between Boeing and the FAA, and we have to address those, and I know we will. The FAA concurred with the JTAR's report and is committed to working on these recommendations, which is good. We obviously have to have oversight to make sure that happens. But lastly, Mr. Muilenburg, I want to hear about recently shared documents relating to Boeing's former chief technical pilot for the 737, and I'm sure you're going to do that. But other investigations are moving forward as well. And last month, the National Transportation Safety Board, they issued a recommendation report which largely focused on the assumptions that were made during the design and certification process related to human factors. Design and certification cannot be the sole focus of our efforts. And I've said this before, that's only one layer of that cheese model that I talked about. In the last few months, other weaknesses that appear to have played a role in these accidents have surfaced. Reports earlier this month called into question evidence submitted to the Lion Air investigation, which related to the installation, calibration, and testing of the faulty angle of attack sensor. There's also been whistleblower statements and other reports raising significant concerns with Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines operation and maintenance programs. The former chief engineer for Ethiopian Airlines filed a whistleblower complaint alleging significant problems with that airline's maintenance, training, and record keeping. He also alleges that the air carrier went into the maintenance records of the 737 MAX. He alleged went into the maintenance records of the 737 MAX a day after the accident. And unfortunately, operational pressures and lack of robust safety culture can negatively impact aviation safety. That's another layer of that model that I talked about. The NTSB has confirmed that along with certification, operational factors are going to be the focus of its accident investigations. And in addition, along with its own MAX certification review, the Department of Transportation, their IG, their Inspector General, at the request of the committee's leadership, is soon going to begin a review of the international training standards in the impact of automation, which is another thing that I've talked about as a potential problem. But I want to be crystal clear in reviewing these areas that this is not an effort to blame the pilots. And I don't blame the pilots, and I don't absolve Boeing of its responsibility. But a September New York Times Magazine article, it described the changing nature of the airline industry and the impact it's having on airmanship. The article refers to a decade-long transformation of the entire business of flying, in which airplanes became so automated and accidents so rare that a cheap air travel boom was able to take root around the world. And this boom in air travel resulted in the need for more and more pilots, but the pool of experienced pilots couldn't keep up. I remember getting letters from airlines all over the world just simply because I had ATP on my license, getting letters offering me jobs to quit what I was doing and come fly for them. But I'll continue to repeat this. Pilots can master cockpit technology, but when the technology fails, they have to be able to fly the plane, not just fly the computer. And to be clear, none of this is reflection on Lion Air or Ethiopia's pilots' professionalism or character. They were fighting for their lives. That's the bottom line. But instead, it's a reflection on the broader pressures that's present today in the global aviation economy. And it's incumbent on the airline whose name is on the side of that airplane to ensure that their pilots are properly trained to the level that they need to be and not rushed into the cockpits to meet those demands. That's where some of this blame lies. In Ethiopia in particular, the government owns the airline, and they put pilots in there that something above their head. It's not the pilot's fault. You have to look at who put them in that position to be responsible for hundreds of lives. So in line with that Swiss cheese model and other layers of, of protection, such as pilot actions, airline operations, maintenance, training programs, they must also be explored, and all of those weaknesses have to be addressed. And I still believe that the FAA remains the gold standard in aviation safety. And once the agency certifies the fixes to the MAX, I will gladly volunteer to be the very first person right alongside Administrator Dixon in the very first flight of the MAX 8. In regard to the two 737 MAX accidents, I think all of those issues need to be addressed, but only after we've had the benefit of various investigative works that have yet to be completed. Jumping to conclusions before that work is done only risks more harm than good. The bottom line is the U.S. safety record speaks for itself, and I'll stand up to anybody that tries to question that. The FAA's proven system has made air travel the safest mode of transportation in history. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity and the deference, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to today's hearing and yield back anything I have left.
I thank the gentleman. I would now turn to the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. I'll be brief because I want to get to the reason why we're here today. That's for questions 2 and clear and direct answers from Boeing. But yesterday I did release a video opening statement, and you can find my full comments there. But in summary, I want to say this, that the 346 lives lost in Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian Airlines 302 crashes, those are constant reminders of the importance of this committee's work and what is at stake if we do not address systemic safety issues in U.S. aviation today. Some of the victims' family members are here with us today. Others are watching on a live stream, and your presence and tireless advocacy are critical to what we are doing today. I want to thank you for that. You deserve answers, and you rightfully expect Congress to act. Following the recent release of recommendations from the JADR, the NTSB, the Indonesian authorities, and Boeing itself, though, I do want to say I see one undeniable conclusion. The process by which the Federal Aviation Administration evaluates and certifies aircraft is itself in need of repair. It is no accident that there are few airplane accidents. It makes it all the more tragic when there is one. It makes it even worse when there are two. So as the committee's investigation continues, we should maintain safety as our guiding principle and use all the tools at our disposal to ensure the safety of the traveling public. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now turn to the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Aviation, Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. Yesterday was 1 year since the Lion Air tragedy, and I too want to join, I think, everyone sitting up here in offering our condolences to all of the Ethiopian family victims, the Indonesian family victims. Here we are in Washington, and everybody in this town, nearly in this town, you sit up here and you're dealing with billions and trillions of dollars and all these crazy acronyms and processes, and none of it often makes sense or fits the common sense test. And oftentimes you see people that just forget about objectives. Why are we actually doing this? What is the purpose of this whole process that we go through, the regulations, the procedures? Why? And at the end, it's always about people. That's what we're here for. We're here for people, for fellow Americans, fellow citizens. And it is amazing to me, just being here, how often that is forgotten. I'm sorry to every one of you, and your pictures are incredibly powerful. You know, I used to be a rock climbing instructor, and when we would go out there, we would have somebody's son or daughter, somebody's brother or sister, And when you're out there rock climbing, look, there's no room for error, none. You lose somebody on a rock, there's no room for error. Air travel is the same thing. There's no room for, you can't, oh, we're going to pull over to the side of the road and see what's going on. I hear a noise coming out of the engine. That's not an option. This process has got to stay focused on the risk that air travel poses. The fact that you can't pull over to the side of the road, that you've got to have redundancies. And look, there's an awful lot going on right now with all of the different reports, investigations that are going on, and I'm going to run through those in a minute. But there's an awful lot going on. But for example, if there truly was one AOA sensor that could potentially engage MCAS, that's not the proper redundancies. And when you're looking at the safety that's posed, the risk that's posed in this case, it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. A while back, I had the chance to represent the state of Louisiana in the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and spent a lot of time with the families there, and spent many days in the court listening to testimony. And I do believe, and I think that the judge found that there was an inappropriate culture of focusing on the wrong objectives. And oftentimes people can be looking at stock prices or economics or how many people can we fit in here, or how fast can this jet travel, or what have you. I'm going to say it again. This is 100% about people. And I've heard people talk about this whole process and say that, well, this process was short-circuited. Well, you know, you can look back and you can look at the 737-6, 7, 8, 9. You can look at the A319, A320, 321, the E190, E195, the C919, and many versions of those aircraft. And you know what? Every single one of those actually was certified or approved in a shorter period of time than the MAX. So it's not just about how long, it's what we actually do during that process. What are we doing during the process to make sure that, that this is a safe aircraft, to make sure that we're not putting folks at undue risk? Now, I've heard a lot of people talk about a lot of different ideas and solutions and things that they want to do, and as we move forward. And people posing solutions right now. And certainly we need to extract every single lesson learned that we can. But right now, and I somehow ditched my list. Right now we have investigations, the Indonesian authorities, the Ethiopian authorities, the NTSB, we have the JATR, we have the Technical Advisory Board, the TAB. We have the Office of Special Counsel that is working with the whistleblower complaint. We have the Secretary of Transportation that set up a special committee. Boeing is doing an internal investigation. We have so many different investigations that are going on. One thing that we've got to make sure that we do is focus on facts. One thing that I've seen in this body in the 4.5 years that I've been here is us responding emotionally to things and not responding to facts. And we'll go and do something that may make us feel good, but does not actually respond to the facts. And so as we move forward, and I'm sure I left out some of the investigations that are ongoing, but as we move forward, we have got to make sure that we are acting on the facts, and every single outcome, every single problem that we have identified, we've got to make sure that we truly base our solutions on those facts to where this doesn't happen again. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, the families shared a number of concerns that I think are right on. And I do want to ask that Boeing get back to us on these. And it was things like fully disclosing the MCAS fix before the plane is allowed to fly, if it's allowed to fly again. Fully defining the role of the MCAS system. All right, I'll submit that.
I would suggest you could
Well,
submit those for the record, or you could ask during the question period. So
you.
that would be,
Go back.
I thank gentlemen. With that, we'll turn to the witness, which for an opening statement. Pull a
Chairman
little.
DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Congressman Larson, Congressman Graves, thank you. And to the whole committee, we appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and we're going to do our best to answer all of your questions. Before we get started, I too would like to acknowledge the families that are here with us today. And again, wanted to tell you I'm sorry. And I've had the opportunity to talk with some of you and hear your stories. And we are deeply, deeply sorry. And we'll never forget. And I want you to know that. And we're committed to making the improvements that we need to make. We're committed. And I had the chance to hear some of those stories and see the photos and listen to personal stories. And it does get to a business that's about people. And I think Congressman Graves said it well. That's where our hearts will always be. And I know all of Boeing, our 150,000 people, feel the same way, and they think about this every day. We will carry the memories.
You're not loud enough?
Can you speak a little closer into your microphone,
sir.
just so a little bit more audible? Thank you.
You can just pull it toward you, Mr. Muilenburg.
Is that better? Thank you. Sorry. Please know that we carry the memories of these accidents with us, and the loved ones, the memories of them, they will never be forgotten. And their memories will drive us every day to make our airplanes safer and to make this industry safer. And we are committed to doing that. I am grateful to have the opportunity to be here today to say this to the families personally. And I want to let you all know that we are dedicated to learning. We are learning. We still have more to learn. We have work to do to restore the public's trust. And we will do everything possible to prevent accidents like this from ever happening again. Mr. Chairman, I know this committee has many questions about the MAX, and we'll do our best to answer those today. And while investigations are still underway, we know both accidents involved the repeated activation of a flight control software system called MCAS, which we've already talked about. That system responded to erroneous signals from angle of attack sensor. Based on that, we've enhanced MCAS in 3 ways. First, it will now compare information from both sensors instead of one before activating. Second, MCAS will only activate a single time. And third, MCAS will never provide more input than the pilot can counteract using the control column alone. Pilots will also continue to have the ability to override MCAS at any time. We've brought the best of Boeing to this effort. We've spent over 100,000 engineering and test hours. We've flown more than 800 test flights. We've conducted simulator sessions with 545 participants from 99 customers and 41 global regulators. I've flown on a couple of flights myself. This has taken longer than expected, but we are committed to getting it right. During this process, we've worked closely with the FAA and other regulators. We provided them with documentation, had them fly the simulators, answered their questions. Regulators around the world should rigorously scrutinize the MAX and only approve its return when they are completely satisfied with its safety. The public deserves nothing less. Mr. Chairman, today and every day, over 5 million people will board a Boeing airplane and fly safely to their destination. Decades of cooperation and innovation by industry and regulators and the rigorous oversight of this committee have reduced accidents by more than 95% over the last 20 years. But no number other than 0 accidents is ever acceptable. We can and must do better. We've been challenged and changed by these accidents. We've made mistakes, and we've learned, and we are still learning, and we're improving. We established a permanent aerospace safety committee for our board. We've stood up a new safety organization, and we've strengthened our engineering organization so that all 50,000 engineers now report up through Boeing's chief engineer. We're also helping to rebuild the communities and the families impacted by these accidents. We've pledged $100 million to this effort. We've hired renowned experts in this area to ensure families can access these funds as quickly as possible. No amount of money can bring back what was lost, but we can at least help the families meet their financial needs. Mr. Chairman, I started at Boeing more than 30 years ago as a summer intern in Seattle. I was a junior at Iowa State University studying engineering, and I'd grown up on a farm in Iowa. My parents taught me the value of hard work and integrity. I was awestruck to work at the company that brought the jet age to the world and helped land a person on the moon. Today, I'm still inspired by what Boeing does and by the remarkable men and women who are committed to continuing its legacy. But these heartbreaking accidents and the memories of the 346 lives lost are now part of that legacy. It's our solemn duty to learn from them, and we will. Recently, there's been much criticism of Boeing and our culture. We understand and deserve this scrutiny. But I know the people of Boeing. They are more than 150,000 of the hardest working, most dedicated, honest people you will ever meet. And their commitment to safety, quality, and integrity is unparalleled, and it is resolute. We will stay true to those values because we know our work demands it. It demands the utmost excellence. So thank you for this opportunity to convey to the world that we're committed to changing and to making sure that accidents like these never happen again. Mr. Chairman, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman. As I stated at the outset, with consultation with the minority, both myself and Mr. Graves will open with 10 minutes, and then we'll move to other members for 5 minutes in the usual order. Mr. Muilenburg, you know, it's clear, obviously, from everything we know and the Lion Air report now that MCAS was a major factor that contributed. But, you know, Boeing's position, at least prior to these crashes, was it was an autonomous system and it operated in the background. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that was the design approach, yes.
Yes. But the question is, how do we get to that? And we have a slide. You'll be able to see it right in front of you. Staff? Yes. This was a concept design for the flight deck in 2012, and as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there was an MCAS alert indicator. So at least at some point, some on the engineering and design staff felt it would be important to make the pilots aware of the system and to have an indicator light. Do you agree that that was originally proposed?
Congressman, understand that was part of an early trade study at that point, and very common that early in the design stage we'd evaluate different flight deck alert systems.
Thank you. So, but obviously the final version did not have that. That light was, I mean, there was no indication either in the manual or on the flight deck of the presence of MCAS.
Congressman, I think John can answer that question.
Yes, Chairman, the MCAS light, as you pointed out, the intent of it was to signal an MCAS failure. It's important to note that in these accidents, the MCAS system did not fail.
Right, it triggered.
And it would not have.
So, but the
functionality of the MCAS light was actually, the reason it was deleted was because the functionality was incorporated into the speed trim fail light, which you can see just adjacent to that. The MCAS is a extension of the speed trim system.
Thank you for that. But when it was a relatively benign system, 0.6 degrees, it was in the manual, and then when it went to repeated 2.5 degrees, it came out of the manual. Is that correct? I have seen very early versions of the manual that indicate that you had MCAS in the manual, your test pilot asked FAA to take it out, and it came out.
Congressman, if I could try to clarify, because you're asking questions that span into a couple of areas, just if I could clarify.
Well,
so there was
succinctly.
The intent, the MCAS inclusion in the training manual, that was an iterative process that was occurring in parallel. to the extension of MCAS to low-speed operation, which I believe is what you're
Right.
referring to. So the extension of MCAS to low-speed operation, that was done and flight tested from a period of around middle of
Right.
2016 to
Yeah,
early
we understand
2017.
that, and we understand some of the problems in the way it was tested and it wasn't tested with the AOA failure, but that's good for now. A key assumption was reaction time. And, you know, with the AOA failure, the MCAS activates, and it's, you know, 2.5 degrees every 10 seconds, pretty radical. And Boeing assumed it would take pilots 4 seconds to recognize and react to runaway stabilizer. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, again, as we do what we call hazard analysis for the airplane design.
4 seconds was the
In this particular
assumption.
case, that was the assumption. That's a long-standing industry assumption for systems like this.
Lion Air report says it took pilots 8 seconds to react. And then we have information provided to the committee by Boeing, which will now be the second slide. And it says there, a slow reaction time scenario, 10 seconds, found the failure to be catastrophic. Do you think that was clearly, was this document ever clearly communicated to the regulators? That a 10-second delay, which doesn't seem like a lot of time to me, particularly when you look at the NTSB report and the cacophony going on the flight deck, and particularly in the case of Lion Air when they didn't even know the system existed. Was the FAA aware of this, this document?
Chairman, I can't speak to this specific document.
Okay.
John may be able to, but I do think it's important to note that as part of the design process, we use a set of industry standard practices on these timelines. This is a common part of our hazard analysis.
But
that
you,
was shared
right,
with the
I
FAA
understand, and I
in the
understand what the industry standard was, but I mean, it does cause a little concern. 10 seconds, I mean, you can say, gee, really good pilots can do it in less than 10 seconds. Pilots aren't, you know, at the top of their game every day, and particularly in the first iteration, at least, when they weren't even aware of the system. You know, I think that assumption should have rung some alarm bells. So, I mean, do you think, in retrospect, it was a mistake to not inform pilots of the existence of the MCAS system?
Congressman, a few things on that, and agree. We made some mistakes on MCAS, and as we've gone back and taken a look at this, moving from a single sensor to a dual sensor feed is an important part of that. Providing additional training information, which the feedback we've gotten from the pilots, as you noted, is part of that. And then revisiting these decades-long industry standards. I think you see a similar recommendation out of the JADA report.
Of course, the question would be, why was it just originally wired to one sensor, which again, single point of failure, as then acting administrator Elwell said in May, a safety critical system. That's just not done. And you know, as the NTSB said, multiple alerts and indication can increase pilots' workload. The combination of the alerts and indications did not trigger the accident pilots to immediately perform the runaway stabilizer, functions. Okay, again, let's just, Mr. Hamilton, are you aware of any other aircraft out there that has a safety critical system that is dependent upon a single point of failure?
Chairman, single point of failures are allowed in airplane design. Regulation 25.1309 actually discusses that and talks about different hazard categories.
And this one was deemed to be catastrophic. I know there's 3 categories. You didn't deem it to be catastrophic, although in looking at the 10-second, you said it was catastrophic. It was classified as major, as I recall.
Yeah, catastrophic is one category. And so when we test out systems, we do look at their impact on the airplane when there's failures. And we did look at 10 seconds, but we also then took it into the simulator with pilots and the typical reaction
Were
time was
you,
4 seconds.
I put up another document, it's right in front of you there, and 12/17/2015. I don't know if you've aware of this, but this was raised by one of your engineers. Are we vulnerable to a single AOA sensor failure with the MCAS implementation, or is there some checking that occurs? Did you ever receive this communication, and did you respond to that engineer?
Chairman, I did not actually receive this communication, but I am aware of the communication recently as it surfaced. In talking with the engineer, I think it highlights that our engineers do raise questions in an open culture. They question things, but it also followed our thorough process and was determined that the single sensor, from a reliability and availability standpoint, met the hazard category and the safety.
Well, of course, we don't know what happened in Ethiopia, but there's some speculation a bird sheared it off. They're pretty delicate little things out there, actually. I've seen them. And now, of course, the final slide here is now, as you emphasize, flight control will now compare inputs from both AOA sensors. And I guess the question is, why wasn't it that way from day one? Why wasn't it that way from day one? If you can do it now with an extra wire or a software fix or whatever, why didn't you do it from day one? Why not have that redundancy?
Mr. Chairman, we've asked ourselves that same question over and over, and if back then we knew everything that we know now, we would have made a different decision. The original concept from a safety standpoint was to build the MCAS, extend the current speed trim system on the previous generation, the 737. That's a system that had about 200 million safe flight hours on it. So one of our safety principles is to take safe systems and then incrementally extend them. That was the safety concept behind the original decision.
All right. Well, thank you.
We've learned since then,
Right.
and that's why we've moved to this new design.
Sure. My time has expired, and I want to turn to the ranking member. Ranking member, Mr. Graves is recognized.
It's hard to know where to start. And I want to go back to just kind of for clarification too, that first slide with the MCAS. If we can bring that, can we bring that up?
First slide, back up, please, for Sam. The one that shows the flight deck with the MCAS.
The
There.
MCAS warning, like, to me, would be, and this is, I guess, more of an editorial comment. You ever been in your car and the check engine light comes on? Yep. And wonder, what the heck? Okay, so what is it? Is it the oil pressure? Is it the oil temperature? Is it the vacuum? I don't know what it is. It's just a general check engine, and the stuff that's more important to me, is the stuff that's on the left, because MCAS manifests itself as a trim issue. It's a runaway trim issue, which again I go back to training, and you have memory items. Every pilot is, I shouldn't say that. In the United States, pilots are taught to have memory items. You instantly go through those when you have a failure. You start through that checklist in your mind, and we have, some of them are even goofy little rhymes or whatever to help you remember, and you go through each one of these processes. And in the case of Ethiopian Air, they never did retard. I still come back to this too. They never retarded the throttles. They set the throttles for takeoff, and they never pulled them back. They went right through the maximum certified speed of the 736 or 737 MAX 8, right on through, right up to 500 miles per hour, way beyond the maximum certified speed. That's the reason they can't manually trim the airplane, is because it's going so fast. And I've used that analogy too. Go down the road at 70 miles an hour. Try opening the door. See if you can open the door and see what the pressures are against the door of your car. The more pressure there is, the faster you're going, the more pressure there is, and the more that the harder it is to try to reverse those pressures. But you go through those memory items, and you immediately start ticking down. And the chairman's right in terms of what's the average? Is it 4 seconds to react, 10 seconds to react? And I guess that's one of the flaws that we need to be thinking about is, I guess we're going to have to start building airplanes to the least common denominator in terms of, and that's a poor choice of words, I guess you might say, but the least common denominator in terms of international, we got to start thinking about, if we're going to export, we're going to have to start thinking about international, training standards. And I know that's one of the things that's being looked at in how they train. Did they have those memory items? Could they tick them off? Most pilots will sit there and they'll do it in the shower. You go through your memory items. I do it all the time in the shower. Just sit there and tick through my memory items on, engine failure, trim failure, whatever those might be. But I guess we're making assumptions, and the FAA is making assumptions, manufacturers are making assumptions about pilot training experience. And in the aftermath of these two accidents, and this question is for Mr. Muilenburg, do you believe that these assumptions, particularly for aircraft that are going to be operated outside of the United States, do we need to revisit those assumptions?
Congressman, we believe we need to go take a look at those longstanding industry assumptions. As you well point out, those are used across manufacturers, not just Boeing. And these are things that have produced safe airplanes for decades. But we do believe that it's appropriate to go take a hard look at those. We may need to make some revisions. I think the JADER report has identified the same thing. And we think that would be a good area for us all to look at on behalf of aviation safety. We are committed to doing that and supporting that study. And one of the areas for the future that we're investing in as we think about pilot-machine interface and how to do that most effectively. And as you pointed out earlier, a large generation of new pilots that will be needed over the next 20 years. And we need to be thinking about designing our airplanes for that next generation.
With the benefit, I guess, and it's always dangerous because hindsight is always 20/20. But knowing what you know now, would the Boeing company have done differently? Would you have done things differently in terms of certification of the 737 MAX?
Congressman, yes, we would have. We have learned. As I mentioned earlier, we made some mistakes. We discovered some things we didn't get right, and we own that. We're responsible for our airplanes. Any accident with one of our airplanes is unacceptable, and that's our responsibility. We own it. We're going to fix it. We know what needs to be done, and that's where we're focused going forward.
I'm going to make a comment here, and it's as a result of this, and the unfortunate part is we lost life. We lost loved ones, friends, and life was lost as a result of these accidents. And you hope that it's never going to happen again. The unfortunate reality is one of these days it will happen again. But I've harped on this, and this is something that concerns me, and I've talked too about the difference in the United States and in pilot training in other countries. But something that concerns me, and I want everybody to hear this. In the United States, what I'm afraid of is we're going down the same direction that we're seeing in other countries when it comes to getting pilots to the point where they can fly. No matter what, we can build the most perfect airplane that's never going to cause a problem, or it's never going to get itself into a bad situation. And sure enough, sooner or later, it's going to get into a bad situation, and it's going to require a pilot to figure out what's wrong and then to come back and fly that airplane. But here in the United States, I think we are dumbing down. And again, this is a criticism of our system, because this is what I'm afraid we're going to. And I want to think about this as we move forward, because I think it needs to be addressed. But in the United States, we taught spin training and stall training in your basic piloting skills for your private pilot's license. Before you get commercial, before you get your airline transport rating, you were taught basic stall characteristics and how to get out of a spin. Today, you can't do that. An instructor is not allowed to let a stall fully develop. At the first warning, this is what it states in the book, at the first warning of a stall, they have to recover or they fail their check ride immediately. That means if the light comes on or if the buzzer goes off, they have to recover immediately. They can't let that stall develop. So we're teaching them how to and this is happening in other countries, because many countries do base their system off of our system as well, but sooner or later, you're going to get an airplane into a stall, but we're not teaching anybody how to get out of that stall and how to recognize it. We're teaching them how to not get into it. Well, that's never going to happen. Sooner or later, you're going to get into a problem. And this concerns me, because we have changed, we have rewritten our, and I've got a problem with the FAA allowing this, but we've rewritten our instruction manuals to not allow this to happen, to not allow these items that will ultimately happen. We aren't teaching pilots how to fix them, how to correct them, how to get out of them, how to save the people that are in the plane with them. Heaven forbid that should happen. And that's, again, that's me harping because it concerns me, and it concerns me in a big way. The United States is behind other countries in ultimately going down that road. And I think we have to get back to basic piloting. And there's nothing wrong with technology. I think technology is great. But the most important safety component in any airplane is a pilot that can fly the damn plane and not just fly the computer. I think I've got a minute left. Actually, I'll just yield back.
Okay. I thank gentlemen. I now recognize the chair. How do we do this in order of? Okay. We do this in order of seniority and appearance. And so first would be Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Chairman DeFazio. I can't say enough about the importance of this hearing. I appreciate you, Mr. Muilenburg, being here. Ranking Member Graves asked, had you flown? I think you even said in your testimony that you had flown on the 737 MAX since the fixes or corrections have been made. That is your testimony.
Ma'am, yes, I've flown on a couple of test flights as part of that
Test flights.
process.
I understood that those to be test flights. But the chairman mentioned that we're trying to get to the roots of the problem so it doesn't happen again, so with FAA, so that airlines like Boeing. And so my questions really go to penalties, whether they have made any difference, penalties paid or outstanding, essentially to compliance, so that Congress can decide what, if anything, it can do. Everybody has an obligation here, Boeing, to be sure, but so does Congress. So the record I have, and I ask you, Mr. Muilenburg, did Boeing enter into a settlement agreement with FAA in an effort to resolve what were then multiple enforcement cases against Boeing that were either pending or under investigation? That was in 2015.
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the details of that, although I'm aware
I simply asked,
of
did
an
you
agreement.
enter into settlement agreement? Surely you know whether you entered into settlement agreements.
John,
I didn't ask you about the details.
Woman, that is correct. We did enter a settlement agreement in 2015.
Thank you. Is it also true that Boeing had to immediately pay $12 million into the U.S. Treasury as a result?
That is correct.
Continuing, is it true that Boeing faced up to $24 million in additional penalties through 2020 if certain conditions were not met?
Yes, Congresswoman, in working with the FAA, they were really looking for creating a long-standing agreement with us to build a good foundation on elevating compliance.
I'm just asking you about the $24 million.
And
My time is limited. In additional penalties through 2020 if the conditions were not met.
there was
Wasn't that the agreement?
There was
the
a deferred
understanding?
penalty. Yes, there was a deferred penalty.
Now, I'm just going to list quickly the obligations improve management and accountability, internal auditing, supplier management, more stringent quality and timeliness of regulatory submissions, simplify specifications. I could go on. These, you understood that that was the agreement. Those were the agreement. Yet in designing and developing and manufacturing the 737 MAX, Boeing has run into issues, problems, characterize them as you will, in meeting the obligations in most of these categories. Would you agree, Mr. Muilenburg?
Congresswoman, we've identified many of those challenges through the MAX development program, and some of those are in the areas that...
And you've had issues in meeting them. Some of this has resulted in the problems that bring us here today.
Congresswoman, I can't give you any specific examples that link the two. I don't know, John, if you've got any
I didn't ask you
details
that.
on that?
Yeah, some of these agreements were agreements that you would make over the course of the 5 years. Each year, we provide a progress report to the FAA on our progress on that, and
Yeah.
there's still...
So I'm not saying you're not making progress, but I'm saying the issues,
There's
as you
still
say, are in black and white.
opportunities- There's still opportunity in the time remaining to meet all obligations of the settlement agreement.
Within the last decade, Boeing has had 2 worldwide groundings of relatively new airplanes, the 787 Dreamliner, the 737 MAX, and encountered many compliance issues in the time since Boeing paid that $12 million settlement payment, and I'm assuming it was paid. Has the FAA assessed any additional financial penalties on Boeing to the 2015 agreement?
No, we are not aware of any additional penalties.
Okay. Time of the general has expired. It would be first Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Muilenburg, are you aware of any aviation accident that can be attributed to a single factor?
Congressman, no. I think the history of aviation shows that these accidents they're very unfortunate, but in many cases they involve multiple factors.
Mr. Hamilton, you agree with that?
Yes, as Ranking Member Graves pointed out, James Reason's Swiss cheese model, all accidents are typically due to a number of contributing causes.
The Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee recently issued its final report into the Lion Air 610 flight, finding 9 contributing factors for the crash. Other than the design of the aircraft, those factors include the miscalibration of sensors during repairs, a lack of flight and maintenance documentation, and failure by the flight crew to appropriately respond to an emergency situation. To quote one of the Indonesian flight investigators, the 9 factors have to happen together. If one of these 9 contributing factors did not happen, the crash would not have happened. Mr. Chairman, I have a copy of that report here and ask for unanimous consent that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Next on our side would be Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put an opening statement in the record. Mr. Muilenburg, Mr. Mark Faulkner's position as Chief Technical Pilot on the 737 MAX was in place at the time of the accident. Who did he report to?
Congresswoman, he was an engineer in our commercial airplanes division. I'm not sure who he reported to directly, but he reported up through our engineering team. John, if you...
Actually, he was in the training department, so he worked through the training organization.
Okay, so there was a chain of command in some way?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. In March of 2016, he asked the FAA if it was okay to remove all references to the MCAS in the Flight Crew Operations Manual and training materials. When he made this request, was he acting on his own, outside the scope of what he was supposed to be doing as the chief technical pilot?
Congresswoman, part of Mr. Faulkner's responsibility included discussions on training with the FAA, but that is more than a single individual. There's a large team that does that work together with the FAA and other stakeholders. And typically they will discuss the contents of the training manual and make iterations on that manual over time to try to optimize it for the pilots.
Was there some way that it was called to his attention that this request was made, and what was the inside discussion?
Congresswoman, I apologize, I could not hear your question.
The first question you responded to, which is related to the second one, and that is, when he made the request to remove all references to the MCAS in the Flight Crew Operations Manual and training materials, when he made that request, was he acting on his own? And you said that it was a number of people. So I am saying, was he just did he have any reprimand in any way for this request being made, or was it a group request?
Congresswoman, part of that discussion on whether to include MCAS in the training manual, that was an iterative process over several years. It included many people beyond Mr. Faulkner. And typically what we do is we want to include in the training manuals the items that the pilots need to fly the airplane. I think Ranking Member Graves described it well earlier. We don't want to put more information in the training manual than required. We want to focus on the data or the information that's needed to fly the airplane. And so typically, over a multi-year time frame, we'll make decisions on whether to include things or not, depending on whether they meet our criteria for what's beneficial to the pilots.
Was he or anybody else in Boeing rewarded in any financial way for removing this requirement and making it simpler for you?
Congresswoman, no. That's part of our obligation. Our responsibility is to provide the best training manuals we can. I know the discussion around MCAS has included, there's been a lot of discussion around whether to include it or not. But again, our focus has been on provide the information the pilot needs to fly the airplane rather than the information that would be used to diagnose a failure. And that difference between flying the airplane and diagnosing a failure is a really important safety concept in our training manuals.
Well, do you recall any discussion that was made around anybody objecting to this decision to remove this MCAS from pilot training materials?
Congresswoman, I can't point you to a specific document, but I know there were discussions, debates on whether to include MCAS or not. That's part of our healthy engineering culture. We bring up ideas, we debate, we encourage that open discussion. That's how we ultimately optimize the content of the training manual.
Have you reconsidered the removal of this material from your training manual, operational manual? Have you had any discussion to reconsider removal of that material?
There were discussions and debates amongst the team. Again, that was happening during that multi-year time frame as MAX was being developed. I don't know, John, if you want to add to that.
No, I agree, but I would say since these accidents, we understand that pilots do want more information, and we are going to incorporate that in our Flight Crew Training Manual and Flight Crew Operations Manual.
It's been one of our key learnings.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Just a quick interjection in reference to the single point of failure. I mean, there was Turkish 981 where a DC-10 went down because the rear cargo door blew out. There was U.S. Air 427, the rudder problem that we had, which was a subject of hearings in this committee. Ultimately determined that the rudder hardovers, we had two of those, single point of failure. And then we had the jack screw on the Alaska flight. You know, so there have been a number, and in this case, MCAS was a major factor. It wasn't the only factor. With that, Representative Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. My condolences to the family, too, and your prayers. They should struggle through this very difficult time. On the MCAS, the sensor, my understanding is on the angle of attack sensors, there's actually 2 sensors, but only one was tied into the MCAS system. Is that correct?
Congressman, that's correct. Depending on sequencing of the flight control computers, one sensor would feed MCAS, but on different flights it could be either sensor, but one sensor at a time.
Okay, because one thing, I'm not a pilot. I fly obviously frequently, but you know, when my friend down here, Garrett Graves, talks about how important it is you can't just pull off the side of the road, and redundancy. So I don't know what you guys were thinking, because sensors, I know from my background in agriculture, a lot of times when we have problems, it's usually a sensor failure that, you know, shuts the system down because the sensor's failing. You just, an analogy. And an airplane, I think redundancy is really would be key. And so I think we've all learned a lesson there that we're going to not just depend on one sensor, correct? You've learned that?
Congressman, that's one of the lessons learned here. We tried to rely on a previous architecture. We've learned, and we're moving to a 2-sensor architecture.
Now, the MCAS system, you know, I'm old school, I guess. Maybe my kids and my grandkids might see it different. But every once in a while, on stuff that I operate, on your phone or whatever, you have to reboot it. So I have to agree with, I believe the chairman, but definitely the ranking member, Graves, talks about make sure we have the pilots be able to fly the plane, and in case, because I know these systems have added safety overall. You know, we've had less issues and tragedies because of the systems, but we've got to make sure humans have to be able to override it. So that's really concerning to me when I heard that Airbus doesn't have that ability to override. I think that's something FAA ought to be looking at. I don't know. That just raises a question with me. But pilot training, testing, and I know we talked about, you know, these 2 catastrophic accidents happened in Lion Air and, you know, Indonesia and Ethiopia. And my understanding is nothing against the pilots. I know they were trying to save their lives and everything, that's no doubt. But their training maybe wasn't what it should have been, the reports I've read. I guess if I was Boeing, a large manufacturer of very sophisticated pieces of equipment, aircraft, what was Boeing planning in the future? You sell these sophisticated aircraft around the world to make sure, other than just relying on their government regulators, because I think I would make sure that the people that are maintaining them, the people that are flying them, have the training and the knowledge and ability and continuing training. And so moving forward, because this is one area I think we can make sure we prevent things like this happening and not rely totally on the infrastructure itself, the asset itself, the technology itself, but make sure we got the human technology, the human behind that. So I guess hear your comments of what going forward, what's Boeing going to do when they make these sales to make sure that you're confident that the people that maintain the aircraft and flying the aircraft have the training and ability, and what Boeing's role would be moving forward.
Congressman, I think you raise a very good point. In that broader area of comprehensive global aviation safety is an area where we're going to make additional investments going forward. An element of that is helping to build the talent pipeline. By most estimates, the world will need about 44,000 new commercial airplanes over the next 20 years and about 1.5 million new pilots and aviation technicians. So we have a responsibility to help build that talent pipeline. We're also going to take a look at the pilot-machine interface on our airplanes and designing that for the next generation as technology is rapidly evolving. We're investing heavily in that area, future flight deck design. We're also investing in additional simulation infrastructure around the world to provide additional training capacity, working with airline customers around the world. Those are just a few examples of what we're doing.
I'm just curious in the case of the 2 cases here, the Ethiopian Lion Air, 2 cases. Did you have simulators over there training, or how's that worked here in the past? What's been the involvement of Boeing?
John, are you aware of exactly what training capacity they have?
I'm not specifically aware what Ethiopia has from a simulator standpoint.
Congressman, if we could take that question, we'll follow up with the details there. I know we have a team that's locally engaged with both airlines, and we'll follow up with the details on simulation infrastructure.
Yeah, I appreciate it, because I think moving forward, we rely too much on our computers and all that, and we know that machines do break too. So I think a lot of time to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, now turn to the chair of subcommittee, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Muilenburg, as we're looking forward prospectively, we need to do our job looking retrospectively a little bit to understand the certification process. That's been the focus of this committee's long-term investigation since March. And so I want to touch on that a little bit. You said today and you said yesterday at the Senate hearing that that's Boeing, we have made mistakes and we got some things wrong. Can you name 3 specific mistakes Boeing made in this process?
Congressman, I would point out implementation of the angle of attack disagree alert. We got that wrong up front. The implementation was a mistake, and we've subsequently fixed that going forward. Secondly, we've learned about the MCAS architecture, the changes that we've already talked about. Clearly, we have some areas to improve there. Thirdly, I would say in the broader area of communication, documentation across all of the stakeholders, and doing that in a efficient and comprehensive manner, we've identified some improvements we need to make there.
Can you identify individuals then who made these mistakes within Boeing?
Congressman, across all 3 of those areas, these are large teams that work together across our company, our supply chain. We have about 900 supplier companies that work in our 737 supply chain alone. The FAA, other global regulators, airlines. So in each of these 3 areas, there are broad integrated teams. There are no one individual that makes decisions within these. These generally are engineering teams that build consensus with all of the stakeholders.
So does that make this an organizational or a cultural problem as opposed to an individual problem that led to these mistakes?
Congressman, I think it's important from an accountability standpoint. My company and I are accountable. That accountability starts with me. And our board recently took some actions regarding my position.
I was going to ask, how have you been held accountable through this?
Yeah. So, Congressman, to your question, our board has recently taken some actions on my position, and I fully support that. That will allow me, again, to focus even more on safety in our internal operations, and these decisions are directed at safety. I have also taken some management actions. We know there are still a number of other reviews underway, and as those reviews are completed, if we need to take additional actions, we will, and those will be firm. And in some cases, they're not individual actions, but as you pointed out, they're organizational or structural actions, and these are equally important. And we've recently announced changes to our safety review board structures to elevate them and make them more transparent. I now receive weekly data reports, very detailed level on our safety review boards. We stood up a new safety organization under Beth Pastor. She now reports directly to our chief engineer, who reports to me instead of being down in the businesses. Our board has set up a new aerospace safety committee that is chaired by Admiral Giambastiani. Just Friday, we announced the addition of Admiral Richardson, who has a deep background in safety. He'll be a member of that committee. And then we've also realigned our entire engineering organization. Roughly 50,000 engineers now all report directly to our chief engineer, who reports to me. And again, this will create additional transparency, visibility, and independence, all with a focus on safety.
So I can't help but think when I hear that, and when I read the JATR report and read the NTSB recommendations from September, and read the Indonesian accident investigation report, that there are changes that we need in how we certify aircraft and components in the FAA process, that what we have now went too far, and that we don't have a handle. We hold the FAA accountable. The FAA is supposed to then hold the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, accountable. I'm not convinced, based on reading these reports and looking at Boeing's own actions, that that's being done adequately. And I'd like to hear your view on well, do you agree with me or not?
Congressman, we believe there are also improvements we can make to that process. And as you're very, very familiar with the delegated authority process, that process we do think is very important to fundamental safety. It contributes to the 95% improvement in safety we've seen over the last 2 decades. But we need to make sure we have the balance right. And we support the reviews that have been announced on that. I think that.
Well, if I could, and I'll finish here, Mr. Chair. If the bookends on this are what former, acting Administrator Elwell said at one time, it would be $2 billion and 10,000 more inspectors. If that's one bookend, and the other bookend is what we have today, I think that we ought to be pulling out a book somewhere between those 2 bookends. Right now, we've gone too far. And with that, I yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as a matter of fact, I want to kind of add to what my colleague from the state of Washington was asking about, and it's about the certification process. There has, as he just asked, there's one bookend of what the FAA actually believes, could be done with billions more dollars in inspectors. We have the current certification process. I don't want to see a knee-jerk reaction here. Look, it breaks my heart and everybody's heart in this room to look over and see those pictures. And I know it does yours too. These are real people who were affected by tragic accidents that we're here to get answers from. But we also want to make sure that we don't see any more in rooms like this. I have many of my constituents who work at your facilities in St. Louis and in Mascoutah, Illinois. I know every one of those constituents that put on that Boeing uniform and go to work every day. It breaks their heart when they see accidents and tragedies like we witnessed. They want to do the best job they can to put a safe plane in the air. They want to make sure no one cuts corners. So the certification process, tell us, so we don't have that knee-jerk reaction, what do you think the sweet spot is from those bookends that Mr. Larson was talking about?
Congressman, I applaud the focus on safety and people. As you point out, we always have to remember what we're doing here is providing safe travel for people around the globe, and lives depend on what we do, so we have to get it right. I think the certification system that we have today is a solid system that's been built up over decades. We have seen very significant improvements in safe travel over the last 2 decades. As I mentioned, about a 95% improvement. That is a result of the current certification system. So we need to maintain what's good in that current system. There's clearly a lot of goodness. I think we've identified a couple of areas where we could look at refinements. And one of the areas we talked about is standards, these long-standing industry standards around pilot-machine interface and the assumptions behind that. I think we're all eager to take a look at that as a potential area of reform. And I think as John has well pointed out, there are some aged regulations on the books that could be updated to represent current technology. And that would also be beneficial.
Well, that's good to hear. And I certainly hope all of us here, we as policymakers, can ensure that we don't have that knee-jerk reaction, because we all have the same goal. And there's nobody in this, probably not many more in the country that fly as much as we do. So we understand the safety of the aviation industry. But it's those instances where safety might have been compromised, which is why you're here. And I appreciate Boeing, I appreciate you admitting mistakes and talking about the administrative decisions that you're making as a team at Boeing to ensure that those mistakes aren't made in the future. We've seen some disturbing whistleblower complaints from former Boeing executives and workers about processes and the culture that may exist at certain facilities. You know, what are you doing to address some of those to ensure that the culture at Boeing, at all of their facilities, is up to par with the facilities that I know my constituents work at in St. Louis and in Mascoutah?
Yeah. Congressman, you raise a very good point, and we want our employees to speak up. When they have concerns, issues, we want a culture where they're willing to speak up. So I encourage those reports. We want to hear what our employees' concerns are. We conduct surveys to bring those up as well, and we provide reporting channels where if employees want to bring up anonymous concerns, they can, and those get immediate follow-up action. And I think it's important when you take a look at those the whistleblower complaints, other points that you've brought up, this is part of our culture of providing visibility on issues. That's how we get better as a company. And I can also tell you, as you know, I know the 150,000 people of Boeing. You know them from St. Louis and Mascoutah. I know them as you do. These are honest, hardworking, dedicated people that know the work they do directly affects lives. And they want to do it right. And they want to do it with excellence. And we want a culture where people can bring up concerns. And my commitment, the culture of our company, I know John shares this, as does the rest of my team, is to be responsive to those inputs, to hear our employees, to take action, and to do that consistent with our values.
Well, I hope the message you take from today's hearing when you go back is thank you for the good job that many of your employees do on a daily basis, but we also expect results. And we want to see those results in all of your facilities. And my time is up. I yield back, and I thank you both for being here.
I thank gentlemen. Representative of California, Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our collective prayers are with the families on a tremendous loss, and I'm glad you're here showing us, keeping us aware of it. Mr. Muilenburg, my question regarding FAA's Organization Delegation Authority Program, known as ODA, that allows your company to oversee certain FAA certification activities. The FAA's Boeing Aviation Safety Oversight Office, or BASU, not only oversees Boeing 737 MAX program, but it also oversees other Boeing commercial transport aircraft programs, including the 777 and 787 Dreamliner. There are approximately 45 FAA employees that work in BASU, but there are 1,500 Boeing employees that work in the organization ODA program. These Boeing employees have a dual role of working for Boeing and representing the government's interest through the FAA. Mr. Muilenburg, do you believe that having 45 FAA employees overseeing all of the critical safety decisions Boeing makes every day regarding commercial aircraft is adequate, yes or no?
Congresswoman, I can't give you what would be the exact right number. We do respect the FAA's oversight authority.
Well, she did, sir, she did ask for a yes or no answer. Do you believe that's an adequate number given the scope of their duties?
Mr. Chairman, I can't answer that specifically. Okay. I think that's the FAA's call. All I want to say is we fully support the FAA's oversight. We think strong oversight is part of what makes the system safe.
Thank you. I think the tragedy of Boeing 737 MAX doesn't just highlight cultural problems at Boeing regarding production pressures and Boeing's commitment to safety, but I think also highlighted a failure by the FAA to provide appropriate oversight of critical issues that impacted safety and ultimately led to the accidents on both Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines. I think the current oversight structure is a critical, very critical issue, and one that Congress is going to need to evaluate in the wake of these accidents. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the remaining time to you.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. I want to return to the market pressures, the fact that you had to design a plane that was more economical and couldn't require pilot training. And I would refer to the first slide here is during an executive review of, unfortunately, it's an Air Ethiopian plane, talking about the MAX advantage. And there was just relentless pressure in the next slide, which is, no flight simulator required. We've had questions about the communications of your test pilot. and we have the polling from your own employees about the pressures. And there's going to be ultimately a determination whether you directly concealed, inadvertently concealed, provided in a fragmented manner, the full MCAS in its radical form, information to the regulators, and that's something we were also going to pursue with the regulators, what their understanding was. Let me just ask a quick question. You know, I know you know why we're here today. 346 people died on 2 airplanes in 5 months. And, you know, you're helping us to try and delve into what we need to fix because we need to change the law. But part of this process really is taking full accountability for what went wrong for the death of 346 innocent people on 2 737 MAX flights. So my question is a simple one, and I hope you can give me a direct response. Who bears the principal responsibility at Boeing for the cascading events that resulted in the crash of Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302? I know that you've lost your board chair, you're still CEO, you still serve on the board. I did happen to look at your compensation last year. You received after that crash a $15 million bonus. What are the consequences? Who is taking principal responsibility? Who is going to be held accountable, fully accountable? I know you fired one person.
Mr. Chairman, my company and I are responsible. We're responsible for our airplanes. And we know there are things we need to improve. We own that. We're going to fix it, and we are responsible. I am responsible.
Okay.
I'm also accountable.
All right.
And I described the actions that we took earlier. And as additional reviews are completed, as additional studies are completed, we'll take additional action. But I am accountable. My company is accountable. The flying public deserves safe airplanes. That is our business.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to pick up where the chairman left off with the no flight simulator required slide. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an engineer, but I don't understand the regulatory distinction between a derivative type and a new type. Is the requirement of a new flight simulator a disqualifier to fit in under a derivative certificate?
Now, let me explain. The 737 is a family of airplanes. Is one of the safest family of airplanes flying in the world today. And many pilots will fly an NG first flight in the morning. They could fly a MAX as the second flight of the day, back in the NG on the third flight of the day. And so one of the market requirements that the customers want is to be able to make it a seamless transition from an NG to a MAX.
Well, let me go back then, because New York Times reported in 2011 as competition grew with Airbus that it was Boeing's position that we didn't want a derivative type, that it was a brand new clean sheet design that is what customers wanted. And so was the presumption at that time that you were going to do a brand new clean sheet design, going to create a brand new type certificate, and no new flight simulator was going to be required?
Congressman, I was actually the chief engineer of the 737 at that time, and we had actually had product studies, as we normally do, looking at re-engineering since 2007. We also had a product development organization that was looking at a new airplane, and just like any good company, we were looking at both options and competing them internally about what made sense to bring to the market. At the end of the day, what the customers really wanted was to have an airplane they could seamlessly transition from their 737s into this future airplane.
Well, when we talk about who takes responsibility, candidly, I'm concerned that we may have created a regulatory environment that makes it so difficult for you to get a new type certificate that you try to stuff all of these changes that should never be stuffed in under a derivative certificate. But what you're telling me is, no, it's your customers who demand that you get derivative certificates, and we, from a regulatory perspective, are not complicit in making it too hard to declare that new model.
I would say that a derivative type cert is not necessarily any easier than a new type cert. As I think someone alluded to, we took over 5 years to do the derivative type cert, which is very consistent with what we do for a new type cert. So they're actually very complementary. And if you look at the MAX's certification, it was very comprehensive.
So when we go back to the IG's report that quotes an FAA official as saying the 737 MAX is not a simple derivative of its previous models, it is a very complex modification incorporating many new and novel features. Boeing is doing everything it can to be exempt from the new certification rules and keep the aircraft the same type rating with minimal training differences. That has nothing to do with the length of the approval process. That has everything to do with the economic pressures Boeing is under to meet customer demand of pilot similarity in a continuing model.
Yeah, the MAX was, with engine technology, we determined that we could get the same amount of fuel efficiency, the same amount of carbon dioxide reductions, the same amount of noise reductions that we pretty much could with a new new airplane. And it was a desire from the customers. So yes, it informed some of the decisions we made, but it wasn't about how we approached certification. It was about design choices we made.
Let's go back to the FAA partnership then, because I appreciate what you said yesterday in your Senate testimony, Mr. Muilenburg, about ODA making American aviation and world aviation safer. I believe that to be true, and I very much worry that in every tragedy, the tendency is to swing the pendulum back too far the other direction. When an FAA official says the MAX is not a simple derivative, it is a very complex modification. It does incorporate new and novel features. What role does Boeing have in requiring the FAA to go ahead and sign off on that derivative type instead of saying, no, we've now looked at your engineering. This is not a derivative type. You must go back and begin this process again. Is ODA implemented in FAA's decision of whether to certify a new type or not?
Congressman, I used to run the ODA, and I was actually leading the ODA at the time. This is not an ODA function at all. This is Boeing as the applicant, as the OEM. We go discuss with the FAA what the certification basis should be for the airplane. And ultimately, it's the FAA's decision. They set the requirement, they set the cert basis, and then we as a company, as the applicant, we have to follow that. It's not an ODA function at all in establishing the cert basis.
I hope we'll bring those FAA officials in, Mr. Chairman, so that we can ask that question, because that is the point of failure, as there's a point of failure in this regulatory process. I yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Mr. Lipinski is next.
This is not a court, and this is not a criminal hearing, but 346 people died in 2 crashes of Boeing 737 MAX planes that should not have been certified to fly by the FAA. I said at a hearing earlier this year, something went wrong in the certification process of this plane. Either the FAA certification process itself is at fault, Boeing is at fault in their role in the process, or both. After I made this statement, I was upbraided by some in the industry for questioning the process. But this committee has a responsibility to get to the bottom of what went wrong in the certification process for the 737 MAX. So we can make changes to that process and assure the public, especially those in this audience and everyone who lost loved ones, assure them that they will not be flying in unsafe planes again. Now, we're sitting here and we heard about accountability. I'm not sure what accountability means. If accountability means, Mr. Muilenburg, you received a $15 million bonus after these planes crashed. I'm not sure who's been held accountable here for this. 2 planes crashed, even after the first plane crashed. I still don't really understand how you have, I'm an engineer, but I'm asking a lot of questions back here, people who are more expert than me. I don't understand how you have a single point of failure. Chairman DeFazio went through that, but it was raised, as the chairman mentioned. There's also another case, there was a internal ethics complaint that alleged that a engineer said that recommended the synthetic airspeed system be put in, which is in the 787 Dreamliner. and was rebuffed because of, quote, cost and potential pilot training impact. Mistakes being made is, a lot of reasons mistakes are made. The problem, the bigger problem, if mistakes were made for financial reasons, and there's a lot of things that seem to point to that in this whole process, and that's what is so concerning. And how did that happen in Boeing? How did Boeing allow that to happen? How did the certification process allow that to happen? In order to get a new type certificate, it takes generally a longer amount of time. I mean, I think most people will agree, Mr. Hamilton, it takes a longer amount of time. It also risks having, most likely you're going to have require pilot training. So all these point back to ways of saving money. And that is a big problem. How do we stop that? Now, I want to ask, the JADR team found that MCAS was not evaluated, and this is something I was listening to Senate testimony yesterday, Mr. Muilenburg, and you didn't seem to agree with this. I'm going to get what you say here. JADR team found that MCAS was not evaluated as a complete and integrated function in the certification documents that were submitted to the FAA. Is that true?
Congressman, the MCAS system was certified with the FAA.
Was it evaluated as a complete and integrated function, or was it step-by-step without ever having the FAA look at it as a complete and integrated system? Because that's what's the important piece of this.
I think what the JADR report points out, and this is an area where we support further looks as well, is when we think about what we call cross-system integration and how we do certification of that. So, for example, a multiple failure mode analysis, high pilot workload conditions. We do think that's an area where we want to look more deeply. The MCAS system and the MAX were certified to our current standards for how we do those analyses. But as the JADR points out,
it was a completely different. It was a very different system. I think that's very, very important. That's something that FAA should have required. I think it should have been provided. But in my last few seconds here, I want to ask: as the 737 MAX re-enters service, will Boeing require airlines to conduct simulator training on MCAS for all pilots?
Congressman, those decisions are the purview of the regulatory authorities around the world, and we will respect
will Boeing lose
their decisions.
Will Boeing have to give money back to any of the airlines if that's the case?
Congressman, money doesn't factor into this decision. It's about safety. So we.
But if it's in the contract, that's a question. My time's up.
Thank you, gentlemen. Representative Kecko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all my colleagues for all these questions today. In my previous life, I was a organized crime prosecutor and routinely had to sit with victims and victims' families more often. And the pain I see on your faces is exactly the pain I saw on those victims' faces. So I just want to recognize that and I hope you understand we are taking this very, very seriously. And I understand, Mr. Muilenburg, last night that you had an opportunity to meet with the victims' families. I know it always had a huge impact on me and how I carried out my cases, and it motivated me to do better and to get to the bottom of the problem. So I want to hear what it was like for you and what was discussed.
Congressman, I want to respect the privacy of the families, but I can perhaps, if you allow me, just broadly describe our discussion. We wanted to listen, and each of the families told us the stories about the lives that were lost, and those were heartbreaking. I'll never forget that. So we talked about their stories. We listened. And we further into the conversation, talked about safety, talked about changes, talked about what my company has learned, what I've learned. We talked about our commitment to never letting this happen again, to preventing any future accidents like this. That was one thing I wanted to convey to the families. But these stories, they're always going to be with us. And I wish we could change that. And all we can do is we have to remember these people. It brought me back to remembering that lives literally depend on what we do at the Boeing Company. That's why I came to this company as a farm kid from Iowa, right? That's what I wanted to work on. And these stories brought that all back.
Well,
so we're never going to forget that, and the commitments we shared with the families and working in their communities going forward, that's very important to us, and we're going to follow up.
I can tell you, I've never forgot any of those conversations with the victims of murder victims and what have you, their families. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and I hope you remember that and it motivates you and your company going forward to do better than you've done. Mr. Hamilton, from an engineering standpoint, I want to switch gears a bit. My colleagues have done a terrific job of asking about this particular issue, but I'm concerned about other things with respect to air safety as well. And through my work on Homeland Security, I'm in my chairmanship of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, very, very, very concerned about supply chain anywhere in public transit. We made a lot of noise in this committee about what New York City was doing with their subway systems, and we made noise with Metro here as well. And so I'm concerned to know what you're doing to ensure that the supply chain is good and is sound, and you're not getting it from bad actors, and also what you're doing to ensure that the ever-spreading and ever-metastasizing cybersecurity problem doesn't infect the airlines themselves.
Certainly. We do have a global supply chain, and we carefully do audits of our suppliers, determine, first of all, should we get something from that supplier or not. And then we have robust follow-up processes, both looking at their quality controls, their producibility, and oversight of our supply chain. And this is one of the things that the FAA has asked us to strengthen, and we are doing that. We've taken some actions on that as well. Every day we get reports in on how the suppliers are doing and whether or not we need to invest and put more actions to improve their operations. You want to talk cybersecurity overall?
Yeah, in addition to that, as John well pointed out, we've got about 12,000 companies in our supply chain here in the U.S., mostly mid and small-sized businesses. So in many cases, we assist them with their cybersecurity infrastructure as well. That's a very important infrastructure to us across our Boeing enterprise. And my CIO, who reports directly to me, is responsible for that. We also have a continuous effort on the cybersecurity of not only our systems, but our products. So cyber hardening our airplanes for the future, ensuring that nobody can gain access to those airplanes is a very important safety design principle for us. And our engineering team spends time on that every day.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
With that, I recognize Representative Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hamilton, on the 30th of March in 2016, Boeing asked the FAA if it was okay to remove all references to MCAS from the Flight Crew Operations Manual and training material. That request was based in part on Boeing's representation that MCAS, quote, only operates way outside of the normal operating envelope. Is that not true?
I believe that is true, that I can't verify the date, but I believe what you're saying is true.
So let me suggest this to you or ask you. On March the 30th, about the same day, Boeing's chief technical pilot at the time, Mark Faulkner, emailed the FAA with the following request. Are you okay with us removing all references to MCAS from the operating manual and the training as we discussed, as it's completely transparent to the flight crew and only operates way outside of the normal operating envelope? The normal operating envelope being the term that flight conditions a commercial airline passenger might reasonably experience. Is that correct?
As Mr. Muilenburg has discussed, it's an iterative process that we go back and forth with the FAA, what needs to be in the training manual, what doesn't. And collectively, the FAA and Boeing reached an agreement that, that the description of the MCAS did not need to be in the training manual.
And Mr. Faulkner requested that, is that correct?
Yes, and Mr. Faulkner's role as chief technical pilot would be the prime interface with the FAA on that.
So he said that was way outside the normal operating envelope, talking about conditions or airplane maneuvers that are beyond what a commercial airline passenger would normally experience, right? That's right, isn't it, Mr. Hamilton? That Mr. Faulkner said that it was outside the normal procedures. You normally wouldn't have that occur on a commercial airline.
He's referring to the MCAS envelope being outside?
Yeah, MCAS should have been transparent to the pilots and assist them only as they approached what we refer to as high alpha or high attitude type conditions.
All right. MCAS didn't activate outside the normal operating envelope on Lion Air. In fact, MCAS activated within the normal operating envelope on that flight. Is that not correct?
Yes, MCAS reacted to a faulty sensor input and operated as it was designed, yeah.
So Captain Faulkner repeated this representation to the FAA as late as January of 2017 after Boeing had changed MCAS to operate at lower speeds in just a few short months before the FAA finally certified the plane. In a recently released email exchange in which he was discussing changes that were needed for MAX pilot training, he reminded the FAA, quote, delete MCAS. Recall we decided we weren't going to cover it in the flight operating manual or the CBT since it's way outside the normal operating envelope. That's get it out of the flight crew operations manual and outside the computer-based training. In hindsight, would you not agree that Captain Faulkner either, one, did not understand, two, downplayed, or at worst, three, concealed the fact that under a scenario that known to Boeing, the failure of a single angle of attack sensor, MCAS could activate within the normal operating envelope?
Again, I was not part of those conversations. You know, I think that was part of leading up to the Fleet Standardization Board meeting and understanding what needed to be presented in that meeting.
You might not have been part of it, but you're an expert, you're an engineer, you're a vice president of Boeing.
That's correct.
Would you not agree in hindsight that Faulkner either did not understand, downplayed it, or concealed a fact that under a scenario known to Boeing, failed to talk to MCAS to act about what would go on?
Congressman...
Mr. Hamilton, would you answer my question?
Absolutely. Congressman, you know, I don't know what was going through Captain Faulkner's mind. What he knew, what he didn't know, I don't want to speculate on that.
Mr. Muilenburg, you want to respond?
Congressman, the only point I was adding is that the MCAS is originally designed. The idea is for it to operate outside the normal envelope, and then the extension to the low-speed envelope, which I think you were referring to, again, that was something that was tested and certified with the FAA from roughly mid-2016 to early 2017.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Muilenburg. You said you're accountable. What does accountability mean? Are you taking a cut and pay? Are you working for free from now on until you can cure this problem? These people's relatives are not coming back. They're gone. Your salary's still on. Is anybody at Boeing taking a cut or working for free to try to rectify this problem like the Japanese would do?
Congressman, it's not about the money for me. That's not why I came.
Are you giving up any money?
Congressman, my board will conduct a comprehensive review.
So you're saying you're not giving up any compensation at all. You're continuing to work and make $30 million a year after this horrific 2 accidents that caused all these people's relatives to go, to disappear, to die. You're not taking a cut and pay at all?
Congressman, again, our board will make those determinations.
You're not accountable then. You're saying the board's accountable.
Congressman, I am accountable, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we turn to Representative Graves.
Mr. Muilenburg, did you fly on a 737 MAX prior to these disasters?
Congressman, I don't recall flying on a MAX prior to, no.
Mr. Hamilton?
Yes.
Do you have any idea how many times?
I don't recall the exact number, no.
Once, 10 times, any
Yeah,
ballpark?
It was probably, I could count on one hand.
I flew on one, I don't know how many times, but I know at least once before. My point is that there are all sorts of things that have come out, including the text messages and other things, that some folks have said this is a smoking gun. I'm going to assume that you all wouldn't have ridden on an airplane if you believed that something was wrong. Is that a safe assumption?
Yes.
All right. So here's where I want to transition. All right. So I talked earlier about all the reports that I did from memory. I think the only one I left out was the Department of Transportation's Inspector General report. We've got outcomes of a number of reports, including NTSB, Indonesian airline. We've got the Boeing board and others that have come out. How do we know that this new process is actually going to have the integrity to where you don't just feel it's right, FAA doesn't just feel it's right, that it actually is right? Does that question make sense?
When you say new process, Congressman.
So my point is that before you flew, I flew.
Yeah.
We all believed that it was right. Now we're potentially going to unground this craft at some point. How do we know that this new process is actually going to work and yield the right outcome?
You know, I would say that, number one, the software changes we're making are going to prevent pilots from ever being in this condition again. But also, the FAA is doing a very robust, thorough review of all our documentation, of all our testing, and that's partially why it's taking us long. But I feel that very confidently that when we get through this, the FAA will clearly say that this airplane is safe.
As I mentioned, you've got outcomes, at least preliminary outcomes from NTSB, Indonesian Air, from Boeing board, and others. Based on what you've seen so far, are there any of these expert recommendations that you disagree with?
You know, I think the NTSB recommendations, the JADA recommendations, they're all, and even the Indonesians' recommendations, I think, you know, we're still reviewing all of them, but I would say after my initial look at them, I think there are some very good recommendations, and we're looking forward to working with the FAA and the industry to address those, yes.
Are you implementing those recommendations now on your efforts on the 777X as it goes through certification?
I would say absolutely, based on the lessons learned that coming out of the MAX, we are absolutely applying those to the 777-9. Some of the recommendations, though, we need to work with the FAA on how they want to respond to some of those.
I would appreciate if you can come back to the committee after looking through some of the recommendations of NTSB and others, and advise us of any recommendations that you do not concur with. Secondly, if you could provide the committee and follow up with just helping us to better understand what changes Boeing is making. And look, I understand, you're part of the system. The airlines play an important role, the FAA plays an important role in others. But what changes you're making to where you felt it was right before, and making sure that there are changes. Lastly, I was going through 5 recommendations from some of the families, and I want to ask that you follow back up with us. Publicly disclose the MCAS fix, clearly define the utility of MCAS, address the concern of the culture within Boeing that might have been prioritizing the wrong things, ensuring that there were not efforts to conceal the MCAS and its role, which I think goes back to defining, and also ensuring that the entire plane is viewed as an integrated system as opposed to components individually that may not recognize sort of their role in the larger system.
Congressman, we'll follow up on all those.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
We're going to recognize, what? Yeah. One more member, and then the panel has requested a break, which I think is quite reasonable, of 15 minutes. So we will, I'll recognize Representative Sears, and then we will have a 15-minute break, and then we'll return.
Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. It's very important. Mr. Muilenburg, in the spring and summer of 2018, did the former general manager of the 737 program ever raise safety concerns with you about production pressure on Boeing's employees who were involved in the final assembly of the 737 MAX at Boeing's Renton, Washington facility? Yes or no?
Congressman, yes, I'm aware of some concerns that were raised in that time period.
Okay. I'd like to read from an email that was sent to the general manager of the 737 program in June 2018, 4 months before the Lion crash, and 2 months before the plane was delivered to Lions Air. The email comes from a senior manager on the final assembly team for the 737 MAX, and he reads like this: I have some safety concerns that I need to share with you as the leader of the 737 program. He wrote, today, we have 38 unfinished airplanes located outside the factory. The following concerns are based on my own observations and 30 years of aviation safety experience. My first concern, he states, is that our workforce is exhausted. Employees are fatigued from having to work at a very high pace for an extended period of time. Fatigued employees make mistakes. My second concern is schedule pressure in creating a culture where employees are either deliberately or unconsciously circumventing established processes. These processes breakdowns come in a variety of forms, adversely impacting quality. Frankly, right now, all my internal warnings bells are going off. And for the first time in my life, I am sorry to say that I am hesitant about putting my family on a Boeing airplane. The employee was so concerned that he recommended shutting down the production. And he states, I don't make this recommendation lightly, he wrote. I know this would take a lot of planning, but the alternative of rushing to build is far riskier. Nothing we do is so important that it's worth hurting someone. Mr. Muilenburg, I know this employee also wrote to you personally in December 2018 after the Lion air crash, as he spoke with Boeing's assistant general counsel several times after that. My question is, what have you done to ensure the safety issues Boeing employees raise are properly addressed? I mean, you went through before a whole litany of what you do with employees. It seems that this one must have escaped somewhere.
Yeah, Congressman, I'm familiar with that last communication that you referenced, where the employee sent, or I believe he was a previous employee, a retired employee.
He's retired, yes. He went on to retire after 30 years.
I recall his email, and we did have several follow-up sessions with him. I told him I appreciated the fact that he brought up those issues and concerns. We do know that our team, who at that point was running a production line that was operating at 52 737s a month, it was a high-rate line at that point, as we had been ramping up production from 42 to 47.
So what did you do about it?
We took a number of actions on taking a look at each of the work locations within the factory, each of the production stops. We implemented some additional quality checkpoints in the process. We also just took a look at his concerns, because he was not actually in the factory at that point, but he raised some good concerns. So we went back and took a look at his concerns, and in some cases we identified areas where we thought his issues had already been addressed. and we provided that information back to him. But this is part of our continuous process in our factories. It's very, very important that we set up a culture where, again, safety is first in the factories, and that comes with quality, as you well pointed out. And safe work is also work that's done in position, and that's one of the big focus areas for us. What happens in high-rate factories like ours, if in a production factory, if you have work that gets behind and it gets out of position, that's when injuries can happen. So our objective is to make sure work can happen in position. That's a safer work environment, and that's an area where we've been very, very focused in our safety efforts, and we will continue to be. So we take those inputs seriously. We evaluated them, we responded, and we're continuing to take action.
My time is up, and I thank you.
Just one quick follow-up. Did you reduce the rate of production at that point in time, given his concerns, from 52?
Congressman, we're currently running the 737 line.
No, at that time, at that time, did you reduce it,
Sir,
given the concerns he expressed?
Sir, we did not change the production
Okay.
rate.
All right,
Again, I
thank you.
think it's very important that when you change production rate in a line like ours, any change, up or down.
Sure, I understand there's a whole supply chain,
Stability-
that's good.
stability is preferred.
If you want your 15 minutes, we're going to have to break now. So we will recess the committee for 15 minutes.